Welcome into another edition of the Hang Time Podcast. Jermaine Mansekou-Smith here in Atlanta. John Schumann is in New Jersey. John Hartzell behind the glass at headquarters. Lord knows what he's doing. Another action-filled weekend of NBA hoops. The Nuggets knocked off the Raptors in a battle of number ones on Sunday. James Harden has got the Rockets back to 500 with huge performances on Thursday and Saturday. He's also back in the mix on the key race to the MVP ladder. And who would have thunk it? The Indiana Pacers, rocking and rolling. Victor Oladipo back in the lineup. Miles Turner playing his behind off and beating the Knicks for their 7th straight win on Sunday. And to top it all off, before we get to Christmas, we got trade winds blowing again. Trevor Ariza headed back to the Wizards for Kelly Oubre Jr. and Austin Rivers. The deal is official as of this morning. But all this started as a 3-team deal with the Memphis Grizzlies involved. I don't know if you read Lang Whitaker's piece with Chris Wallace or any of the other comments Chris Wallace made afterwards, but the confusion over which Brooks was involved in the deal, Dylan or Marshawn. I've heard of some crazy stuff going down around trade time. I've never heard of the Brooks mix-up in a trade deal. Have you ever heard of anything as ridiculous as we got the wrong Brooks in the deal?
I don't think so. I don't think you were on Twitter at the time. I mean, that was a top 10 sort of NBA Twitter moment. Those like half an hour where you have, a Phoenix reporter saying it's definitely Dylan Brooks. And then a Memphis reporter saying it's definitely Marshawn Brooks. And then obviously the teams realizing that they aren't talking about the same guy because apparently Washington was the one talking to both teams with no interaction between the Grizzlies and the Suns.
What it sounds like to me, Shu, is that as often is the case in trade situations, everybody's trying to play the dozens. Everybody is scheming, and somebody slipped up this time. And this thing, once it leaked out, you couldn't stop it from coming out in all directions.
Yeah, the leaking out was the one that was the part that I was going to bring up. It's like, okay, so how does it leak out to multiple reporters who are now reporting it on Twitter with still confusion between the teams about who's involved in the deal? Like, that's the part that made it bad. Like, it's one thing if that all happened and the news never got reported, and then we hear 18 hours later that the Wizards have traded Oubre and Austin Rivers to Phoenix for Ariza straight up. And then maybe you hear a few years later that, it was really, supposed to be a 3-team deal, but the Suns thought they were getting Dylan Brooks and the Grizzlies thought they were trading Marshawn Brooks. The problem is that it all happened in front of, in public, like that that ends up being the issue. And you have to, obviously some people were PO'd about the whole situation.
Some people would be Chris Wallace, who was less than diplomatic in the comments he made, which I think he has every right to be. And this is the issue when you have third parties involved and there's a disconnect between the teams who are trying to make these deals. And NBA Twitter has taken over the atmosphere. I mean, these things leak out. They end up having a life of their own. Rumors turn into headlines. And from there, there's really no stopping it. At the end of the day, though, even with all the confusion, does Trevor Ariza fix the Wizards? Does he fix what's wrong with them?
No, I think what fixes the Wizards is the guys that are already there playing better. John Wall and Bradley Beal and Otto Porter and those guys just playing 48 minutes.
Playing like Wall did against the Lakers.
Playing focused for 48 minutes instead of giving us 20 minutes or 25 minutes of good basketball every night. It's interesting. I guess they basically had no future plans for Kelly Oubre.
I'm assuming it's because they know he's got to be paid this summer.
Right. And they're already paying Wall.
And they're already,
So I guess in that way, it's not a long-term loss, but maybe other teams would have been interested in a Kelly Oubre, and maybe they could have gotten a different kind of asset than a Trevor Ariza, who, even if everything works out with him and even if the other guys play better, at max, this is the 6th seed in the East, right? I mean, I don't think there's any catching the top 5 teams, especially with Indiana playing as well as they've been.
I think a lot of it probably had to do, Shu, with the fact that Trevor Ariza has history with the organization in Washington, and everywhere he's been, Trevor Ariza has been exactly what you wanted him to be. A consummate professional, a no-nonsense guy, a locker room presence for the good, very productive, and he plays both ends. That, to me, this whole thing is what's lost in it is that just as I thought he would be, even though he went into free agency last summer with that big offer from Phoenix and couldn't turn it down, Trevor Ariza is a valuable player in this league to a lot of good teams for precisely the reasons that this deal was getting everybody all caught up in a drama. I mean, he's the kind of veteran presence you need on and off the floor, has the type of game that fits basically everywhere, and he does it without a hint of drama. So, I mean, I get why you would want Trevor Ariza in Washington. I just don't know. I agree with you. I don't know that he's a big enough pill to fix what's wrong with the Wizards on a daily basis.
And he could come in and be their best defender, but if the other four, if three guys are defending well and two guys aren't on any particular possession, it doesn't matter. Yeah.
There's no question about it. Their issues are much greater than one person. I remember a few weeks ago, everybody thought Dwight Howard might be the person who could fix what's wrong with him, and that obviously wasn't the case. It brings us to another week of the NBA.com Power Rankings, Week 10 rankings. Denver Nuggets, number 1, Milwaukee Bucks at 2, Raptors at 3, Warriors at 4, and the Pacers, as I mentioned earlier, winners of 7 straight after Sunday's victory over the Knicks at 5. Shu, when is the last time there were 3 Eastern Conference teams this highly thought of? Not just in your rankings, but I'm going to throw it even further. When's the last time we thought there were 3 legitimate championship teams in the Eastern Conference?
Oh, geez. I was going back. I got a question from Tom Heights, and he was asking me about three East teams being at the top of the league in point differential. I'm like, oh, that's an interesting question. So I just started digging, and I kept digging, and I kept digging. I had to go all the way back to 1983-84 to the last season where 3 Eastern Conference teams led the league in point differential. And that year it was Boston, Milwaukee, and the Knicks. Right now, it's Milwaukee, Toronto, and Boston. So 2 of the same teams, and the Raptors, who didn't even exist in 1984. And so, yeah, it's interesting. Like, it's, 5 deep, the East looks great. Once you get to 6, then everything sort of falls apart. But, we've been talking about, hey, let's get to the Eastern Conference semifinals for a long time. But the Pacers certainly look better than ever, and it's time to think, okay, there's going to be a really good first-round series in the East as well, at least one.
Do the Pacers have the personnel, Shu, to break through that 4-team group we've been talking about? You think they're capable of?
Think about how close they were last year to beating the Cavs. I mean, they blew multiple opportunities to win that series against the Cavs last year.
Right.
We've said this before, and they outscored the Cavs by 40 points over those 7 games and lost 4-3.
Just didn't have LeBron. Seriously, I mean,
I think they can play playoff basketball. I mean, I think they have the pieces, especially with the improvements we've seen from Domantas Sabonis. He's only in his 3rd year. Miles Turner still getting better, and even Bojan Bogdanovic, who's been having a terrific year shooting the ball. And I think Corey Joseph has also had a sort of an underrated bounce back season off their bench, and his defense has been terrific. I really like watch him like sort of run around chase guys running around screens on the defensive end of the floor.
Just how tenacious he is.
Yeah, he is really good at getting through and around screens, and he's kind of fun to watch if you just sort of focus on him on a few defensive possessions. So they've got lots of capable players. The matchups will be interesting. Like a Bogdanovic having to match up at the 3 with some of the East forwards is going to be interesting. But as far as 1 through 8 or 9, I mean, they're really, really good.
They're the team of the week on your power rankings, the Indiana Pacers. And I know we don't talk about many of their players individually in terms of honors and all-stars other than Victor Oladipo. What's changed? I mean, what's the big difference for them? What has gotten to the point where they can play as long as they did without Oladipo and be as successful as they were.
Their defense has been really good. I mean, they've basically ranked, I think, first or second defensively over the course of their winning streak.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Turner, I need to see like a 20-game stretch of him before I start to really believe.
Right. Not just 5 or 6.
Yeah. But he's averaging like 17 over the winning streak, and like I said, the defense has been much better. Turner is a big part of that, obviously, but I think they've been pretty good also in the minutes where they've dared to play Turner and Sabonis together, which is good. Thaddeus Young has had a couple huge games last week against the Bucks and the Sixers, two of the two best.
He's great defensively.
The two best teams they've beaten on the streak are Milwaukee and Philadelphia, and Thaddeus Young was a huge part of those two wins.
Let me throw one more thing into the mix, and you tell me if I'm off base. Can you remember a coach resurrecting his reputation the way Nate McMillan has from the time he was let go in Portland to what he's done now as the head coach in Indiana? I remember people saying, he's a dinosaur. He just couldn't adapt to the new style and the way teams were playing in the league. He's been like ideal for this Pacers bunch. I mean, a great fit after they had plenty of success, with his predecessor. But this has seemed like it's probably worked out even better than the Pacers thought it would.
Yeah, I mean, and he's outlasted. We thought that firing Frank Vogel after the years of success that he had in Indiana was weird, right? And Larry Bird gave us that that sort of 3 years excuse or something like that. Oh, they stopped listening to you after 3 years. But then Nate McMillan has outlasted Vogel in his new stop in Orlando, obviously. So I think the back, his reputation from Portland, I don't know if people thought he was a bad coach. I think it was just interesting. Like, he had this rep as a defensive coach in Portland, and then there was just a little bit of backlash from maybe the analytics community, of which I'm a part of, because they just played really slow in Portland, and so their defensive numbers on a sort of per game basis looked better than they actually were, and they were actually really successful offensively. Mm-hmm. And you see some of that in Indiana, where they play at a really slow pace. But like I said, the defense has been terrific over this winning streak, and they do take a lot of mid-range shots. They are a little bit old school in that their sort of 3-point to mid-range ratio is near the bottom of the league. And so, because Turner, he pops to 20 feet instead of popping to 23. A lot of guys, Collison, Joseph, Oladipo, very comfortable sort of stepping in and shooting pull-up mid-range jumpers. So there is a little bit of old school with that team, but it's working. They're really tough to guard. I mean, their pick and roll game is really tough to guard with both Sabonis, whether it's Sabonis rolling to the basket or whether it's Turner popping out. He's making some really good decisions on those pick and pops. If somebody comes to him, he's finding the open guy no matter where he is. It may be weak side corner, it may be a high-low pass, but he's making really good decisions out of the pick and roll too.
Yeah. The one team that you have listed as your team to watch this week in the Power Rankings is the one team I keep finding myself staying up late to watch when they're on the West Coast, and that's the Sacramento Kings. 6-2 in December, 11th in the Power Rankings, playing at Minnesota today. They've got OKC on Wednesday, the Grizzlies on Saturday, and the Pelicans Sunday. So a huge, huge statement week for this young Grizzlies team if they want to take advantage of a shoe. Nate Jones, who I think we both follow on Twitter, threw out a very interesting question yesterday. And I thought about it for a long time, and I was like, man, that is rough. His question was, who's the better pro long-term between Luka Doncic and De'Aaron Fox? And it's a tricky question because they're both young guys in the sense that they're young in age. One has far more high-level professional experience, obviously, in Doncic than the other. But I would argue that Fox is probably a more accomplished NBA player at this point, not only because he's got a year on Doncic, but because he plays on both. He can play on both ends as well as he does. But I think that's a fascinating question, and one that if you're a fan of the Mavericks or the Kings, you should be fired up about, because you've got some discernible young talent that looks like it could lead you for years to come. In dynamic playmakers guys who aren't traditional playmakers in terms of traditional point guards, but both, in my eyes, would fill that void for those teams in terms of being the primary playmaker. Who would you take? And again, shout out to Nate Jones for bringing this up on Twitter. Who would you choose long-term between De'Aaron Fox and Luka Doncic if you had to pick?
I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah.
I mean, really, I don't. I'm not, I'm not a hot take machine whatsoever, and I certainly don't have an answer. Doncic would be, I mean, I guess it would depend on who else I have. I mean, Doncic is probably more comfortable playing off the ball, whereas Fox probably at this point needs to have the ball in his hands. But Fox, with that quickness, I mean, he can break down a defense. Doncic can get where he wants to go, but Fox with that quickness is just impossible to stay in front of.
Right.
And I would say Fox is a better defender at this point, although Doncic has size, so he's not necessarily a long-term liability on that end of the floor. It's a great question. It's fascinating. I mean, Fox, I mean, I guess Doncic is just got a little bit more well-rounded package, I guess.
Yes.
So that might be my determining factor. Like if I would worry about Fox when he doesn't have the ball, where I wouldn't worry about Doncic when he doesn't have the ball. Right. So it's a fascinating question. I guess I would lean Doncic, but it's not a strong opinion.
Right. And let me double check and make sure I didn't butcher his question, because the question might actually have been more along the lines of who has the ceiling, the higher ceiling, which to me is always a tricky question. No, actually it was the right question. Who will be a better player long-term, Doncic or Fox? And I got to thinking, we don't spend as much time debating players, like players, young, bigs, whatever, as we used to before everybody started viewing these things through a different lens, through the analytics lens, which you do as well as anybody. Analytically speaking, what has a higher ceiling in today's NBA? An ultra-skilled wing player or a dynamic, athletic point guard? And the reason I ask that is I think of Russell Westbrook, and I think of John Wall, and all the different point guards who have come into the league, Ben Simmons, guys who maybe have a flaw in their game, but because they're playing what I think is the preeminent position, even though we still focus on the perimeter wing players as the kind of the dominant guys, that having an elite athletic point guard, to me, is the first step in putting you over the top as a team if you don't have LeBron or Kevin Durant, or one of the handful of truly transcendent, and even if there's that many of them, wing players. I think if you got a point guard like Fox, you could get to competitive as quick as anything because of a dominant, elite athletic player at that position.
It's a good question. Take like last season's Chris Paul, for example, of a dude that just was smart and skilled, not very explosive, barely gets to the rim, but just such a good shooter off the dribble and such a good sort of operator, with a pick and roll where he just can get a half a step on a defender and get him on his side. And then obviously a great isolation player. Take that versus, I don't know, like a Fox or a Ben Simmons. Like, who did you want running your offense? I guess it depends on what you're looking at too. Like, are you playing Game 7 against the Warriors or the Celtics? Like, maybe that's a different answer. Then you get a different answer than if you're playing 82 games over and playing a lot of teams that you can sort of take advantage of in transition and early offense.
It's just interesting. I'm sending Nate a tweet. I'm very reluctant to play around on Twitter, seeing as how I've been hacked and smacked around by hackers on every social media platform to finish out 2018. But I'm sending him a hat tip on Twitter right now for the topic, because like I said, it got me to thinking about it. I was wrestling with the idea of it, and not just this debate about these two guys, but similar ones. I know you're not a hot take master, Shu. You made that clear. But I want to, when we have a slow week, which is never, John Hartzell, I'm challenging you to, we're going to do a debate podcast where we come up with a bunch of players that we want to make, compare and contrast their games, their whatever, their careers, what they could be. And I'm challenging you, Hartzell, to come up with 10 players, five different debates for a future podcast where we can examine some guys and debate who ends up being the better player. It'll be awesome. It'd be like a time machine thing where, 10 years from now, somebody could dig that thing up and tell us how wrong or right we were. But I love the topic. And in today's NBA, where we spend most of our time trying to keep pace with, the action that's going on, we don't sit around and debate these kinds of things as much as we used to. I think the calculus now has moved at such a wild and rapid pace that we don't sit around and argue the trivial, inconsequential things like this as we used to, as we should. We only do it like at the finals or in the playoffs when there's enough of us around in one place to chew on this kind of stuff.
It helps that there's just, I think, more first and second year players with a ton of potential than we've had.
Yes.
Maybe we've had in the last 5 or 6 years. Just thinking about last year's rookie class and this year's rookie class, two of the best classes we've had in a while. And then next year could be fun too. So I think that helps the sort of discussion like that, the debate of who do you got, over the next 10 years.
Yeah. Like I said, just a fascinating thing to think about. The other problem with that shoe, I remember like years ago, God, I guess it has to be 10, 12 years ago, you used to text back and forth with people while you were watching the game. Like now everybody's on Twitter. So it's not just you and one other person texting back and forth or you and a couple people on the group text. It's you and 6 bazillion people tweeting. But I remember like Lang Whitaker used to be a co-host here on the podcast and worked with us at NBA.com, good friend of the program and a great friend of ours. Lang and I used to text back and forth nonstop during games. Like, he'd be watching some of you seeing this or you watching this, League Pass, this and then. Like I said, Twitter snatched that whole that buddy cop thing away, watching games. Like, because now people are on Twitter, doing the same thing and they're just doing it with a much bigger group and a much bigger audience.
It was a struggle for everybody to get out their Mel Brooks or Marshawn, their Scott Brooks isn't in the trade or the Brooks was here thing from Shawshank Redemption, all that stuff. I mean, people were struggling to get that stuff out ahead of everybody else on Twitter on Friday night.
Yeah, I'm glad to refrain. I just enjoy being a Twitter voyeur. I read tweets and laugh, and rarely try and dive in the mix because I get enough hate tweets as it is. I'm going to also respond to some tweets one day on this podcast with some people who want to bellyache and moan and groan about their favorite player not being on number one on the MVP ladder every week, as if you email me and make this great argument, Shu, about why I can't believe you don't have this guy number one on your MVP ladder. Here are all the reasons he should be number one. By the way, I'm a huge fan of his or whatever. It's like, yeah, that's the problem. Like, I'm not fanning out on any one guy or I don't have any rooting interest. I'm trying to be as logically impartial as possible. So, yes, if you get mad at me because I don't respond to you, going off on me or trolling me on Twitter, sorry, but it's not going to happen. Anyway, the other team that had me scratching my head over the weekend, Shu, because I'm now seeing the vision of exactly what they could be, and then I watch them fall flat sometimes when they just don't have enough to put their finger on the button to zap that energy into their team the way they need to, is the Lakers. I watched Lonzo and LeBron get matching triple-doubles the other night in the game. Both of them getting triple-doubles. Looked great in that win over the Hornets. And then they come back against Washington, and John Wall just takes them apart. I'm as impressed with Lonzo's performance this season as anybody could be. I think the strides he's made have been huge playing alongside LeBron. Not as easy to do as everybody thinks. I also like his focus and the fact that the whole off-the-court circus has not been a factor for him this year. But are you concerned at all at the ways that the Lakers kind of roller coaster right now in terms of being great at moments and then looking like the doomsday, Lakers that people were worried about would show up this season with LeBron in tow?
Well, I mean, that Washington loss was the second game of a back-to-back, and Washington was rested. So it was a rest, what I call a rest disadvantage game, whereas they were playing the second game of a back-to-back against a rested opponent. So you could sort of put that into context. They were missing JaVale McGee. I don't know how important that might be to you, but Tyson Chandler's been good, and they were destroyed in his minutes on the floor, so it doesn't. Maybe the McGee absence doesn't really matter.
Right.
They're a little bit of a feast or famine team in sort of more ways than one. I wrote something on last week about how this was through Wednesday's games. They were number one in effective field goal percentage in the first 12 seconds of the shot clock, and 30th in effective field goal percentage in the last 12 seconds of the shot clock. So they are a team that flourishes in transition, but struggles, sort of in the half court offense when they have to come up with a bucket, against a set defense. So, and the two guys that sort of exemplify that most are Ball and Kuzma, who are the two guys that have sort of struggled most. I looked up Ball's numbers again this morning. He has shot 27%, 26 for 98, which is 27% in the last 12 seconds of the shot clock. So he is like him and Kuzma. Those two guys are great in transition. And I think it's interesting that rather than sort of cater to LeBron, this team has sort of kept its personality from last season. They sort of kept the young guy personality where they run, they try to play in transition more rather than sort of walk it up with LeBron. Not that the Cavs ranked near the bottom of the league in pace. They didn't. But you can sort of see that, and we saw it with the roster moves, and that they went with playmakers over shooters, in that they've sort of haven't bent towards LeBron as much as maybe you would have expected, and as much as other teams have in the past, especially Cleveland. So I think that's kind of fascinating. But like I said, it's been a feast or famine proposition, because while they've been really, really good in transition, they have been not good in the half court offense. And it'll be fascinating to see if that continues, and then if it continues, how that translates to the postseason.
Sure. Do you think it has anything at all to do with the fact that you can't play generally with a traditional setup point guard with LeBron? Like that you have to have a kind of an off-the-ball complementary point guard when you're playing with LeBron? So you can't get into half-court sets all the time when LeBron is managing the action in the game as often as he does.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you can go all the way back to Mo Williams and how, while people will sort of rip him for being, he had some rough playoff performances, but he was a really good the Cavs took a big step forward back in 2008-09, I guess it was, when they got Mo Williams. He
made an all-star team.
Yeah, and he was really good for them for 2 years, because he was a guard who could handle the ball, but who could also shoot. And I think that was sort of a sign going forward as to the best way to complement LeBron. And Mario Chalmers was a sort of a similar guard. And, both of those guys sort of fell off once they stopped playing with LeBron. And so it's an interesting, and Ball is still not a good three-point shooter. The one thing he's improved in is his finishing at the basket off of last year, where I think he shot less than 50% in the restricted area last year, and I think he's up to 60% this year. But he's still a poor three-point shooter, struggling in the half-court offense, but still a good rebounder and a good defender. So he gives you good things. It's just maybe not the ideal complement to LeBron, especially in the half-court offense.
And I have very little to complain about, where LeBron's impact is concerned on a team. I mean, he's shown himself to be worth basically any and all the headaches when he joins your team, because the overall level of success rises dramatically. But this is one of those rare things about LeBron that I think you hear a lot of veteran players and former players voice this, how tough it would be to play with a guy like LeBron if you're a certain kind of complimentary player, because you have to be a very specific talent. You have to zero in on a certain skill set to complement him the right way, or the way that suits best to LeBron and his game, in order to fill that role. And it's not easy. It's not something that a lot of people have been able to do. Even the guys who have done it at the highest level haven't been able to do it for an extended period of time. I mean,
it took Dwayne Wade. Dwayne Wade's a Hall of Famer. It took
Kyrie Irving.
It took Wade more than half of season to adjust and to really know what to do when LeBron had the ball, as far as cuts off the ball, because obviously he never became a great 3-point shooter.
Right.
And obviously this year it's no secret that the Lakers have been much better with only one of LeBron or Brandon Ingram on the floor than they have been with the two of them on the floor together. And then obviously that's going to be fascinating to watch, whether the Lakers think of Ingram as a piece for them going forward, or if they just see him as a piece of the next trade, the next big trade that they make.
These are things that we dive deep into on the Hang Time podcast on Mondays. We always take a look at John Schuhmann's NBA.com power rankings. Check them out. They are live and on NBA.com as of this moment. Dig in, digest, direct all animosity towards John Schuhmann. After you're done, he's well built for it. You'll get a nap today. Sure, you get a little.
Just don't expect a response on Monday. By the
way, we're gonna spend some time Thursday, Shu, if we can, taking a pre-Christmas look at the league. Christmas is always my day. I say this all the time. That is my measuring stick day for teams. Even more so than the first 20 to 25 games. There's something about the Christmas Day schedule and the vibe around the league at Christmas. To me, that's everybody's already in a lather, of course, the teams they've been playing for months, but something about Christmas is a signal. Like, I like to watch who comes out of the Christmas Day showcase games, what teams come out after that stretch between Christmas and, say, the week leading up to All-Star. As that stretch is an opportunity for a lot of teams to make some noise, to make changes, to put themselves in a completely different light than they may have been prior to that time. Trades like the one we talked about earlier with Trevor Ariza joining the Washington Wizards certainly can factor into that. Getting injured players back healthy around that time, or integrating a guy into that mix during that time becomes a factor. All these different things that could play into it, but be very curious to examine the NBA pre-Christmas or right around Christmas and then going forward. We'll do that again on Thursday's episode of the Hang Time podcast. So we'll be back, and we want you to make sure you come back and join us, listen, and enjoy the conversation. Be sure to subscribe to Hang Time on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts for new episodes all season long. For my main man, John Schuhmann in New Jersey, John Hartzell at headquarters, making it all happen, and Sekou Smith here in Atlanta. We appreciate you. Don't forget to leave a review. Let us know what you think, and we'll see you right here next time on the Hang Time podcast.